Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on mastering your qualitative methodology. My name is Rachel, and I'm a senior qualitative research mentor here at Statistics Solutions. I wear quite a few hats around here, including qualitative mentor. We are a full service dissertation consulting company. And what that means is that we are here to help doctoral students at really any stage of the dissertation process. So we can help with assistance as early on as topic development, all the way through to the end. We can provide assistance and support through, getting that final slide deck together for your dissertation defense at the very end. We have qualitative mentors on staff. We have quantitative mentors on staff. We have research mentors on staff. Most of us have been through the dissertation process before on our own, so we know what it's like. We have thousands of hours that we have worked with doctoral students. So we are here to assist with the dissertation. We also provide a lot of amazing free resources on our website, statisticsolutions.com, including this webinar series. There are some awesome links in the chat to some of those resources. And we also provide a complimentary consultation, and that is a 30-minute consultation with one of us to discuss how we can best assist you in the process. So during that consultation, we get to know a little bit more about you and your project and your own sort of areas of need and concern, and figure out how we can help out, where we fit into that. So, like I said, my name is Rachel. I'm a senior qualitative research mentor here. This is the Mastering Your Qualitative Methodology webinar. I am also joined by Brittany in the background, just in case there are any technical difficulties that I encounter along the way. That is not something that happens often. And Brittany will also be able to field any questions that you have during the webinar related to what we do here at Statistics Solutions. If you have questions about the content of today's webinar, so that is qualitative methods and design, please go ahead and pop those into the question and answer box, and I will go ahead and answer those at the end. We'll make time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions that come in about qualitative methods and design. But any other questions, if you go ahead and type those in during the webinar, Brittany can field those for you behind the scenes during the webinar today. One thing that I will mention as well before we get started is this is obviously qualitative, not quantitative. We do have some amazing quantitative mentors on staff, and they run other webinars related to quantitative methods, design, analysis, all of that. I'm not the person you want answering any questions about your quantitative research, honestly. It's been a very long time for me, but I do specialize in the qualitative side. So if you have quantitative questions, definitely make sure that you check out those webinars. So this slide really introduces the main sections that you'll want to include in your methods chapter of your dissertation. So oftentimes this is the chapter 3 of a sort of more standard 5-chapter dissertation. It's not always the chapter 3, but for most that I see, that's where this chapter falls. So it's part of the research proposal, along with the introduction and the literature review. And this overview of the sections also provides the roadmap for today's webinar. So we will touch on each of these sections: the introduction, the research design, the role of the researcher, methodology, issues of trustworthiness, and the summary in the webinar today. Now, one thing to be aware of, if you have a template, if you have a checklist that comes from your chair, department, school, what have you, please follow that. Okay, this provides an excellent roadmap. If you include all of these sections, you are going to be very, very well set up to have a complete methods chapter, but certainly always use what your school provides. Okay, so in your introduction, okay, just like other introduction sections that you have written, And like everywhere else, you see the purpose of the study, you want to restate the purpose here. Okay, so I like to think about, as I'm writing, leaning back and leaning forward. Okay, so you're reminding the reader of everything that's come before. So in this case, you would already have your introduction and your literature review chapters. So you want to present a little reminder of that. And you also want to look forward ahead at what's going to be covered in the chapter. And so that's the preview of each section. One thing about the purpose of the study, and this goes for the research questions as well, but anytime you state these, they need to be exactly the same. Doesn't matter what chapter they appear in, verbatim, exactly the same. This is not the place to get creative with your wording, because changing wording can inadvertently change meaning. So even if it seems very boring at this point to be stating something exactly the same way, that is what you want to do. Okay, and then, as I said, just provide a little overview of the sections that will be in each chapter, or that will be in the chapter that you cover in this chapter. So you'll include a section on the research design. I often see this next. And I should point out also that this is a compilation of what I have seen required of students in their methods chapter. So this compilation of sections comes from 4 years of work with over hundreds, with hundreds of doctoral students, okay, over the years. So these are the sections that I see most typically that go into the methods chapter. So you will, again, restate those research questions verbatim, exactly as they appear in your introduction. If they appear in your literature review, they will be exactly the same as well. You will identify and define whatever that concept is that you're studying. If it's a phenomenon, if it's a case, you want to identify what that is very clearly and define and describe that. You will also identify the tradition. So is it qualitative or is it quantitative? And so for our purposes today, we're looking just at qualitative, right? So identify that it's a qualitative study and whatever that qualitative design is. So is it a case study? Is it a phenomenological study? Is it an ethnographic study? You want to very clearly tell the reader what that is. And in this section, you want to think about a couple of things. So the first is that you need to demonstrate that you are familiar with different options, okay? You can only decide that one tradition and one design is the most appropriate for your study if you know how all of them work, okay? So what you need to do is show that to the reader and show that to your committee and your dissertation chair. So you want to present a little bit of information on both qualitative and quantitative approaches and what they're useful for. And then within that, make the case that the qualitative is the best approach, and then do the same for the design. So identify several qualitative designs that might work for your study so that you can then narrow that down to the one design that is the most appropriate. So you're building the case that this is the most appropriate design. And in order to do that, as I said, you have to demonstrate that you understand other options. Now, qualitative designs are really helpful when working with textual data, and they're helpful when we are trying to understand perspectives or experiences. Those are sort of key words that if you see them, if you use them in the problem or the purpose statement or the research questions, that should tell you that you're probably looking for a qualitative design, okay? Your research problem, purpose, and research questions determine your design, okay? It's not the other way around. So you wouldn't start a study and say, I'm going to conduct a qualitative study, and then backtrack from there, okay? The purpose, the research questions drive the design. It's not the other way around. So Again, if you see words like perspectives and experiences, you know, make sure, you know, that probably means that it is a qualitative study. So you'll also want to be aware of different data collection techniques in qualitative design. So often we rely on interviews, focus groups. You may see some kind of document analysis, observations, different types of data collection. So we don't use things like, I mean, you can use surveys, but we're not trying to quantify anything, right? And we're not testing hypotheses. So often we rely on interviews or focus groups, and we may use other data collection techniques as well. The goal here is not necessarily to generalize. Okay, so in qualitative studies, we're often looking at, you know, a real specific concept. And so there's not the need to generalize in the same way that we would in maybe a quantitative study. So this list is absolutely not exhaustive when it comes to qualitative research designs. This is a list of sort of what I see most commonly in the students I work with. And out of these, the case study, phenomenological studies, and generic studies, I see certainly most frequently. I occasionally get grounded theory studies. I occasionally work with students who are conducting ethnographic studies, but those are much less common. So you will include this section on your research design and outline whichever is the most appropriate. And then, like I said, you know, show that you're familiar with and understand how some of these others work. So this is not a webinar on design necessarily. So this is a fairly high level overview of some of these designs. So a case study is very helpful when we're looking at a specific example case or cases. A very in-depth look at something perhaps over time. Okay. And often, you know, this might be something like an atypical case. So something that doesn't fit an existing pattern, something that we see an exemplary case. There's perhaps a counterpoint or something for a new direction in research. But there's something unique about the case. So a case study we can think of as sort of this holistic look from sort of all angles at whatever that case is. Occasionally we see multiple case studies, so there might be more than one case. And if that is true, then they are bound by some kind of uniting factor. So everything, you know, within those limitations, or those delimitations, right, that mark the boundaries of the case. That is the case. Everything outside of it is not. Because case studies offer this holistic approach, then we use different data collection techniques, and usually multiple data collection techniques. So oftentimes more than one. So you might use interviews, you might use documents, you might conduct observations. And so you bring all of the data from those different data collection techniques together to create, you know, this really clear, rich description of the case. And you can, you know, thematize findings, which are basically, you know, patterns that exist in the data for the case. So it's this in-depth look and then in-depth description of that case from all of these different angles. That is different from, say, a phenomenological study, which is rooted deeply in philosophy and then psychology. And so here, if a question is more about what is it like to live an experience, right, then a phenomenological approach might be appropriate. So here you're looking for sort of, you know, the essence of a phenomenon, okay? Assuming that there is some kind of shared, like, common experience that people have with a phenomenon. And so this is often conducted through in-depth interviews, several hours, perhaps multiple interviews over the course of weeks or months. But this is trying to understand how people make sense of a phenomenon or that lived experience, how they assign meaning to that experience. Okay. And so, as I said, the sort of goal is to uncover whatever the structure, essence of that phenomenon is, and then how people make meaning out of it and the patterns that exist there. Sometimes what happens is that a study doesn't quite fit into, a phenomenological study or a case study or a grounded theory study or an ethnography. And so I also see quite a few generic qualitative designs, or you could also maybe think of these as sort of more general qualitative approach, or like a descriptive approach, descriptive qualitative design. But the idea here is that, if something isn't purely phenomenological or purely case study, this approach can be very helpful because it allows you to sort of select what makes the most sense for your study. Okay. And when I say that, I don't mean that you can simply pick and choose whatever you want. Everything has to be justified. Okay, so it's not like, I think I'll do this for, my data collection, and I'll do this for my analysis because it sounds good. And, it doesn't go that way. It's still, it has to be rigorous. It has to be justifiable. It has to be defensible. So while you do have options, they have to make sense for the context of your study. So a lot of times you might see this if, in phenomenological studies, the focus is really sort of like the psychological and the meaning making. And sometimes that's not what we want to know. Sometimes we want to know sort of what the outward experience is. Okay. Sometimes we're conducting mixed methods studies that also involve a quantitative component. And so just sort of a more generalized or generic qualitative design can be very helpful for these. Again, there are options for data collection, interviews, questionnaires, surveys, documents, observations, sort of any of those. Again, as long as it makes sense in the context of your study and you can justify why. So I do occasionally see chairs who don't believe that a generic qualitative design, and you will see in the literature that it's called a generic qualitative design. Some chairs don't think that this is an actual research design. And, they don't believe that it's rigorous. And that is not true. I think that there is this perception, this misperception that generic means not as good because we hear it used in that way in other aspects of our lives. But that's not the case. And so this Percy article, Percy and colleagues, which I realize is a little bit dated now, I think is very, very helpful for thinking through and demonstrating why a generic qualitative approach, why this design can be most helpful. So if you're struggling to justify this design, I recommend looking up the Percy article. So as I said, I less commonly see grounded theory and ethnography. Grounded theory functions somewhat differently from other qualitative designs, in that the starting point is sort of a little more abstract. So the idea is that you're generating theory based on your data, okay, as opposed to beginning with a theoretical framework or a, conceptual framework and having that drive the research. So here, the aim is actually to develop the theory or that broad explanation of whatever it is you're studying that's rooted in your data. And so it's helpful when we don't know a whole lot about a topic. It is conducted using interviews, certainly, There's field work involved, text and document analysis, memoing, theoretical saturation. Grounded theory works in that their data analysis and data collection run concurrently. So you might interview a few people and analyze the data. And then from those results that are generated from the first participants that you've interviewed, then you might seek more participants who can sort of, tell you more about any questions that come out of that data analysis. So it just sort of works back and forth until you reach a point where you are no longer learning anything new. Okay, and so again, the idea is that you are looking to produce this theory or model, right? Something that explains what's happening, the process, the action, the interaction, whatever that concept is. And then ethnography is really, it's rooted in anthropology in particular, and social sciences. We see it in sociology as well. But it has this fairly broad application when we're looking for, it's sort of part understanding a problem in the sociocultural context, but really it's this holistic look, this very close look at we can think of a group of people, right? Some kind of social group, and it might be an organization, it might be an institution, but assuming that that group of people has a particular sort of, shared culture. So this is conducted through, again, interviews. Like I said, most qualitative designs include some element of interviews, oftentimes extended field work and participant observation, which means that we're not only conducting observations from the side of a classroom or the side of an office building, but we are engaged. We are participating in what other people are doing, right? We engage in conversation with people. So again, lots of different data collection techniques that occur in ethnography. And so the idea is that it produces this in-depth account of, whatever that research problem and how it's addressed, whatever that is from the perspective of participants within this context of that culture, right? No matter how large or sort of small. So like I said, we certainly don't have time to cover all of the possible qualitative research designs here. This is just to give you an idea of where you can start to look, thinking about your own study. But as I said, your problem, your purpose, and your research questions will ultimately drive whatever that design is. Okay, so you'll include that section on the research design. You'll include a section on the role of the researcher, and that is you. So what is your role in the research? We impact our research. We are humans, we are working with humans. So we have some kind of impact, okay, some kind of role. And so what we want to do is recognize that we have some impact and recognize that we are perhaps biased in some ways, and identify where those biases occur and describe how we will handle them, how we will mitigate them, okay? So again, your role as the researcher, are you an observer? Are you a participant? Are you both? Do you have, are there power dynamics between you and your participants or conflicts of interest? What biases do you bring to your research? What will you do to mitigate those? Consider if you're conducting a study at your own organization where you work, right? Or if you are a teacher, your own school, okay? What are the possible problems associated with that, and how will you handle those? That's what you describe here. Your methodology section. So the methodology is like the instructions, okay? So if you think of sort of a step-by-step, if you're looking at a recipe, okay, you have ingredients and you have instructions, and the methodology is the instructions. So you want to describe all of the steps that you will go through to In this case, recruit participants. Who are your participants? What is the population of people from which your sample will be drawn? So all the possible people to whom your study applies or who could be participants. They are not all going to be participants. But what is that larger population and how will you sample? So in qualitative research, we use purposive or purposeful sampling. It is not random, okay? You'll outline in this section the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So again, what are those characteristics that people need to possess so that they can participate in your study? And then describe how you'll verify this. The number of participants that you will recruit, steps to identify, contact, and recruit those participants. And again, think, sort of recipe fashion. It can be helpful to outline these sort of as, bullet points like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but that's not how you want them to appear in the chapter. You want them to appear in narrative form. But if it helps, you can certainly write them out initially as, step 1, IRB approval. Step 2, make contact with, a point of contact, and then turn that into a narrative. You'll also describe the size of the sample and its relationship to data saturation. So how will you know when your data are saturated and there's nothing new to learn about what you're studying? You will include a section on instrumentation as well. So if you are conducting interviews, you will include an interview protocol in your appendix. Very likely you'll want to mention that in this section and describe how you develop the interview protocol. If you're conducting observations, you want to probably have an observation sheet. Okay, again, like a protocol that tells you what you are looking for so that you can maybe make notes, checklists, that kind of thing. So for each source, for each data source, you'll want the instrument. You want to identify, are you creating it on your own? Is it something that's already published? Oftentimes we are creating our own instruments in qualitative research, so that's certainly not always the case. If you are using something that's already published, just make sure that you have permission to do so. You'll need to obtain permission, and then you'll want to mention that in this section as well. If you're conducting a document review, you'll want to describe how you will identify sources, but also importantly, how you will verify their accuracy. And then demonstrate how those sources of data will address your research questions. So how do we know that your interviews will provide the right information to answer the research questions? So for each of those instruments, then you'll also include where you will collect data, who you will collect data from, the frequency and the duration of data collection events. So perhaps you're conducting interviews and you're doing that, maybe 3 interviews with each participant, and each interview is anticipated to be 2-hour interview or something like that. So you'll describe that here. How you plan to record your data. And then any contingency plans in case of attrition. So as I said, we are humans, we are working with humans, and humans sometimes don't follow through when we want them to. And so if you have recruited 15 participants, if you're aiming for 15 participants and it comes time for interviews and you can't get in touch with 3 of the people who you recruited, how are you going to handle that so that you ultimately have a sample of 15 people? You'll also outline any debriefing procedures. So following interviews, just kind of the closing discussion or any follow-up procedures that you might employ. So transcript verification, member checking, those are, 2 of sort of the most common follow-up procedures. For each type of data, then, again, you want to just show how the data are connected to the research. So how the data will address the research questions or answer the research questions. The data analysis plan section is sort of where you do that. And so data analysis plan, depending on your design, that will drive the data analysis plan. Some are very particular about how you analyze the data. So you want to make sure that you're familiar with what that is for whatever design you're using. So it will inevitably involve some kind of coding procedures. So the way that we make sense of textual data by reducing it down to descriptive codes, and then starting to pull those codes together into categories or patterns. You will identify any software that you plan to use to facilitate the analysis, and sort of describe where that fits into the coding process. Software does not do the analysis for researchers. It's entirely researcher driven, but the software is really helpful for organizing and visualizing qualitative data. So if you plan to use that, you'll describe that here, and then how you plan to handle any discrepant cases. So when you're exploring these patterns that exist in your data, what happens when you come across something that doesn't fit the pattern? That's a discrepant case, right? It doesn't fit. And so how you plan to handle that in your analysis. You'll include a section on trustworthiness. So there are these sort of 4 tenets of trustworthiness that we use an awful lot in qualitative research: credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. So basically, how confident are we that the findings are accurate and applicable to other contexts? Are they consistent, based on replication? Are our findings based on what participants say and not what we think? So there are different ways to establish this. And in this section of the methods chapter, you will outline, I like to recommend sort of one little subheading and section for each of these. Identify, what it is, what it means. Of course, with citations, there are a lot of them available. Lincoln and Guba from 1984 is so old and kind of the classic that I see people use. And then for each of these, what you want to do is describe how you plan to establish trustworthiness in your own study. You'll also include a section on the ethical procedures that you plan to use. The main thing, of course, is ensuring that because we're working with humans, we're treating them correctly. So any ethical considerations related to gaining access to participants, gaining access to data, access to research sites. So usually that'll include IRB from your own school. You will likely need some kind of permission from the research site. It may be the case that your research site has its own institutional review board or IRB, so you might have to submit 2, depending on what you're doing. Basically, making sure that no harm comes to your participants. So that could be, psychological harm if you are conducting a study that's a little bit tougher, in terms of like a tough experience to live through. But it also has to do with making sure that nobody knows who your participants are, that they're not identifiable to anyone. So how you will ethically recruit participants, how will you ethically collect their data, and how you plan to handle the data. So less likely is anonymously. Okay, so anonymity versus confidentiality. Confidentiality is who your participants are, what they've said, you have their data. Anonymity would be if those people are not known to you at all, and that's pretty unlikely in qualitative research. So we need to maintain confidentiality, but you usually won't see the term, you know, or terms anonymous or anonymity in a qualitative study, and how you plan to secure the data and what you plan to do to destroy the data after a set period of time. And it's usually that your university will say you need to hold on to the data for, you know, 5 years or whatever, and then you can destroy it. So in your summary then, you know, again, you want to sort of recap for the reader what you have told them already in the chapter. Pull the reader along, again, leaning back, leaning forward. If they just had to rely on your summary section to understand, you know, how you plan to conduct your study, then what needs to go in here, right? It's kind of the elevator speech, and then present a transition to the next chapter. And so you'll sort of highlight what's coming up in the next chapter. So other tips that I have for writing this, you know, they're sort of the main sections, but then I also, over the years, have seen clients really trip up here because it's thinking through something that you haven't done yet. And so I see people spin their wheels on sort of the what ifs. What if things don't go according to plan? You know, plans will always change. Things will always change, and that's fine. Okay, you can handle that later, but this is what you plan to do to conduct your research. So start with these questions. Okay, you've got your problem, your purpose, and your research questions, and figure out, you know, who do I need to talk to? What data do I need? What documents do I need? What observations do I need? Right? How do I get the answers to my research questions, and work from that point? So again, think of this as writing a recipe. There are 2 parts to a recipe. Okay, so we're making chocolate chip cookies, and we have the ingredients for the amount of flour and chocolate chips and butter and, you know, all of the other good things that go in chocolate chip cookies. But if that's all that we have, we don't know how to make chocolate chip cookies because we don't have the instructions. The instructions tell us what to do with those ingredients. Similarly, if we only have the instructions, we don't know the quantities of the ingredients. So the methods are the ingredients, the methodology is the instructions, okay? So it's sort of 2 parts. These will change, okay? It's safest to approach this chapter and approach your study being comfortable in the knowledge that things will change. You will handle that later, okay? So write this as though this is the expectation, this is what you plan to do, and know that in the results chapter, you will be able to come back and talk about how things changed, what changed, how they changed, why they changed, how they impacted your results or interpretation of results. It may be that some of the change presents a limitation to your study, and you'll address that in your discussion chapter. Perfectly okay. But don't let this chapter trip you up at all. There is amazing information available. There are entire journals dedicated to research methods in qualitative research that are out there. Lots of different options, again, for design, data analysis, you know, all of that, but it's all there. It's just a matter of putting it together and understanding that things might change. So if you're still stuck, this is where we come in, okay? And so again, we are Statistics Solutions. We have been in operation for over 23 years, assisting doctoral students at every stage of the dissertation journey. And the goal is to get you through and get you on with your life. So we have qualitative mentors, quantitative mentors, research mentors available to help with topic development, all the way through, as I said, to that final defense and helping you put together the best presentation for that defense. We offer a complimentary consultation. You can call us, you can use the link in the chat to get that scheduled so that we can talk a little bit more about your own needs and how we can fit into that. We also have a lot of complementary resources available on our website, the webinar series, blogs, tools, instruments, all kinds of good stuff if you want to check that out as well. So I'm Rachel. I'm a senior qualitative research mentor, and do have time for questions. I've got a couple in the question and answer box. And so, yeah, if you have questions, please type those into the Q&A box. And I will read those out loud. So I have a question about, is generic the same as qualitative description? The way that I have seen it used most commonly is yes. Generic, I think, I don't know that they're 100% interchangeable, but, you know, because the focus may not be like descriptive in generic, but certainly, you know, the way that I have seen most often is that they, you know, in terms of sort of selecting data collection techniques and data analysis techniques, and yes, you have some of those like same options. And then the next question is, can thematic analysis be used with qualitative descriptive? And my answer to that is, again, yes, but it has to make sense for your study if thematic analysis makes the most sense. So yes, it absolutely can be used with the qualitative descriptive, but, you know, make sure that everything makes sense for what you're studying. The authors for trustworthiness, it's Lincoln, like Abraham Lincoln, and Guba. Again, difference between generic and qualitative descriptive. Again, so difference in name still provides same for either sort of the same options as far as selecting data collection techniques, data analysis plans. So that qualitative descriptive is going to be a little bit more focused on sort of how participants describe something, and that might be a little bit different in focus from a generic study, but otherwise, sort of functionally in terms of setting up the design, not necessarily different. I have a comment. I don't know if this is that qualitative descriptive uses quant data, but I'm not sure. That's not what I have seen. Let's see, hold on one second. I'm trying to clear a couple of these out so that I can see all the questions. Qualitative descriptive generally does not use quantitative data. I mean, it's a qualitative design, it's qualitative descriptive. So it's not, there's not a use for quantitative data. It's not a mixed methods study. For trustworthiness, good question. How many approaches are needed? So I realize that the way that I sort of have that slide set up, it makes it look kind of mutually exclusive. Let me actually, I'm gonna bump back to this, and I usually catch myself and note this in this slide, but it makes it look like triangulation can only be used for establishing credibility, and that's not the case. So you know, you don't necessarily need one different approach for each of these four aspects of trustworthiness. You know, triangulation can help establish like any of these four. Member checking, transcript verification can also be used. So, so the answer again is sort of a, you know, qualified, like it depends what makes the most sense for your study. Since qualitative description and phenomenology do a deep dive into participants' experiences, what is the biggest difference? So phenomenology, like I said, is really, it is heavily psychological and it borrows a lot from philosophy. So there are certain philosophical assumptions associated with phenomenological studies that are not associated with qualitative descriptive studies. Is grounded theory work as a, I'm not entirely sure what you mean. There's a particular way of coding and analyzing interviews in grounded theory. So if that's sort of what you mean by evaluation method, then yes, it uses its own sort of particular language for the data analysis there. Triangulation means that you are using, I sort of think of it as like multiple perspectives. So I think the easiest way to think of it is multiple data sources, but that can mean different things. So it could be that you triangulate based on interviews and observations. So you have two different, very different data sources there. You might triangulate based on maybe you are conducting interviews with school teachers, and maybe you're also conducting interviews with administrators. So two different groups of people that might triangulate. So it is sort of bringing these together to corroborate findings, right? Because ideally they'll all sort of tell you the same thing. And I mean, if they don't, that's certainly interesting too. And the other thing is, in qualitative research, triangulation doesn't mean three. So two differences is just fine. Two different, you know, data sources is just fine. Doesn't have to be three, even though try is in there. Yeah, I get this question a lot. Is there a software that I like for data coding and creating a code book? Yes, and that software is whatever you can get for free or at a discounted price through your school. They all fundamentally do the same thing. They all have a lot of bells and whistles that you don't need. I am a very sort of basic user of software. I don't need a whole lot of you know, a whole lot of the bells and whistles. So my answer is always, you know, if you're in graduate school and maybe on a limited income and your school provides you something at a reduced cost, or as I said, even free, it's worthwhile to get that one and learn it. You know, they all have their little quirks. They all function a little bit differently in terms of the actual, like, sort of, you know, how you're moving around, how you're navigating in the software, but they all do the same thing, which is code and help you organize and store your data. So I like what's free. I have a question about using a phenomenological design, and I am concerned about rigor. So it is okay. Is it okay to address the approaches to trustworthiness, but I used some of them from my study? I'm not sure I'm understanding the question. So like, right, so okay, so certainly trustworthiness is sort of the establishing rigor. And you do you do want to talk about what you know, in the methods chapter, what you plan to use, and then in the results chapter, what you did end up using. But I'm not sure I fully understand sort of the rest of the question. I'm sorry, I don't know if you want to type in a clarification or not. Ideal sample size for qualitative study is going to depend on your own purpose and research questions. Unfortunately, there's not like sort of a, it depends. It depends. You're going to want to look to the literature, what other scholars have, studied before you, what sample sizes have they used and that kind of thing, and get a feel for what's best for what you're trying to accomplish. Finish with data collection, use different data sources, but are worried that you perhaps didn't have enough participants. Do I explain that in results, or do I try to go back? That's a great question. I absolutely can sympathize. I felt very, very much the same when I was conducting my field work. And, I was in a position where I worked overseas in a different country, and it really wasn't an option to go back and get more participants and collect more data. And so I just had to sort of be okay with, I did the best that I could for data collection and, describe that. So it kind of is up to you. Do you want to try to collect more data? Do you want to try to recruit more participants? I think, things to keep in mind are, is it going to cost more money? Is it going to cost more time? Is it something that, have you already been working on data collection for a year, or has it only been maybe a month or two? And so you do have a little time to spare to go back. So those are the kinds of things that I would maybe factor into that decision. Great questions. If there are more, go ahead and, like I said, type those into the Q&A. That way everybody can see and I can answer them for everyone's benefit. I don't see anything else coming in. If there are last minute questions, please go ahead and type those into the Q&A. A comment, I appreciate the idea that the method section is explaining what I plan to do in this case. They planned this many participants, this many, and in reality wasn't able to recruit and keep as many. Yeah, I like to think of it, for those proficient on social media, there are sort of those memes that go around every once in a while, like the side-by-side pictures of sort of expectation and reality. And I kind of think of the methods. I mean, it's a little flip, certainly for a dissertation, but I kind of think of it in those terms to lighten it up a little bit, that the methods chapter really is, your expectation of how everything will go. And that's set up if everything goes exactly according to plan, and we can build in contingencies. And that's a good idea to do in the methods chapter, but sometimes it doesn't happen that way. Sometimes, I don't know, we get like a pandemic worldwide and it impacts things. That happens. And the best we can do is just sort of work with it and do the best that we can and describe what happened. And, just be okay with it and know that everybody else writing a dissertation right now is going through the same thing. Other questions? Yes, always look for good memes to support the work. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for joining me this afternoon. As I said before, we have got an entire webinar series available. So if qual is not your thing, we have quantitative webinars. We have webinars on the discussion chapter and the literature review chapter. If those are the chapters that you're on, we have so many resources and we are here to help. So again, you can schedule a complimentary consultation to talk more with one of us about how we can help out. Otherwise, please take advantage of everything that we have on the website. Thank you again for joining me this afternoon. I really appreciate it. Maybe it's evening where you are. Actually, maybe it's morning. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, wherever you are. Take care. Bye-bye.